أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. In the previous classes, we were discussing the basis for taqlid, following a marja, a scholar, an expert. We examined this from a logical perspective. What does logic dictate here? We examined that. Then we examined a verse from the Holy Quran and several hadiths from the Ahlul Bayt that scholars have cited to establish the basis for taqlid. There is one final discussion that is concerned with taqlid, which is an important discussion, and in fact two actually, but the second one is the most important one. And this might be an area where akhbaris and usulis disagree a little bit. Is it on mute? Okay. Is it still mute?
You could just ask them, can you hear me?
Okay, I think it got resolved now. So there are two differences between akhbaris and usulis, and previously we mentioned the brief difference between akhbaris and usulis. They are Shia scholars. They agree on many principles. They just have some differences when it comes to extracting laws, some minor differences. The first difference, or the first discussion is, does the scholar whom I follow have to be living, or can I follow a marji' who has passed away? Let's say I believe a Shaykh al-Tusi or a Shaykh al-Mufid or some other scholar is knowledgeable, he's an expert, he may be the most knowledgeable, so I follow him. I take out his book of rulings and I follow him. Why do I need a living scholar to follow? Do we have any hadith that specifically obligates you to follow a living scholar? Or the point is to follow an expert, whether the expert is alive or the expert is dead. You will find that many akhbaris have allowed for people to follow experts even if they've passed away. They say as long as they're experts, we can follow them. The majority of usulis disagree. They say, even if it's based on precaution, that you must follow a living marja, a living scholar. Well, why? What is their proof? What's their evidence for that? There's basically one proof that they've cited, and there's also an important philosophy behind it too. Yes?
Usulis are most of the scholars that are prominent,
Yes, today most of the maraja are usulis. Basically, they have adopted a school of thought that extracts laws and basically analyzes the principles of law in a unique way that is a little bit more developed than the akhbaris. And they also do more analysis of the chains of hadith. Many akhbaris in the past, they considered that the four books, such as Al-Kafi, At-Tahdhib and others, are completely authentic. So just look at the content. No need to go and research and investigate the chain, because these are trusted sources. Usulis have a slightly different opinion, and they usually give more importance to the chain of the hadith. Even if it's mentioned in Kafi, I still have to investigate the chain, right? So there are some differences between the usulis and akhbaris. Today, modern scholars in the seminaries and the maraji', the majority of them are usulis. We still have akhbari scholars, but I would say they're the minority. The majority are usulis in the houses and seminaries. So the first evidence that they have cited when it comes to following a living marja, a living scholar, is an intellectual law that is called in Arabic دوران الأمر بين التعيين والتخيير. Whenever you're presented with two options, two scenarios, two paths, one of them you're sure it's Hujjah. If you follow it, you have fulfilled your obligation. You have certainty. There is absolutely no doubt about it. The second one is doubtful. You really don't know if you have the option of taking the second one. Maybe it will fulfill the condition and the obligation, maybe not. There is some doubts about it. The intellect here dictates that you have to follow the path that is certain. And you basically take what is called the ta'yin, not the takhir. It's not optional for you to choose between one of these two. Stick to the one that you know will definitely free you from the obligation. So let's apply this to the maraja. If I follow a living marja who's alive in my time, I refer to their expert opinion and I believe they are knowledgeable. Does that free me from the obligation of implementing God's laws? Based, of course, on the evidence that we've examined for taqlid. If I follow a living expert, does that free me from my obligation? Do I have certainty that my taqlid is correct? Or do I have doubts about it? I have certainty about it. But if I follow a dead marja, a scholar, an expert who has passed away, and I don't know if the views of someone who has passed away, his expert views, are binding on me, are hujjah on me, are acceptable for me in Sharia. I don't know. I don't have evidence. It's possible that it is, yes, maybe 70% chance, 80% chance, yes, as long as he's an expert. Doesn't matter whether he's dead or alive, whether he's living or he passed away. But I have some doubts that I need to follow a living expert. When you're presented with a case like that, what does the intellect dictate?
Living.
Why? Why does it dictate the living?
It's the safer route.
It's the safer route. It's the certain route. You know for a fact that in your area you can follow an expert. But you're not really sure if the expert fatwas of someone who passed away are acceptable in the Sharia. It's doubtful. So you take that which is certain over that which is doubtful. And this is an intellectual principle. And this is a principle many scholars have used to demonstrate that you need to follow a living scholar. By the way, this is not limited to taqlid in religion. It is also inclusive of other types of taqlid, like following a doctor. Let me present this scenario for you. If right now you're diagnosed with a medical condition, disease, illness, some condition, you go and search who's the best or who's a good doctor in your area. You go to that doctor, to that surgeon, you take the prescription from them, and you seek treatment. Do you have any doubt about this being valid? Going to a living doctor and seeking the prescription from them? Do you have any doubts about that? Or you're doing something which rational people accept and they find acceptable? Which is it?
Considerably less doubt.
No. Is this acceptable, going to a living doctor for my medical needs?
It is acceptable.
For most people,
Do rational people say yes, you can, or they say no, don't go to a living doctor?
these days they rip you
These
off.
days,
son.
yeah, there's-
There's what?
These days they rip you off.
They rip you off.
But
there's
yes.
people who say.
So if you have a medical condition, right, and you want to seek the prescription of someone, rationally you go to someone who's living, an expert who's alive. And that definitely, in the eyes of rational people, frees you from your obligation of protecting yourself and keeping yourself healthy. No one blames you. But what if, after discovering, the medical condition that you have, you go and you take the prescription of a dead doctor. In fact, you go to Jalinos, the famous Greek doctor, right? Who was known in history to be one of the most knowledgeable physicians. Someone says, look, I really like this doctor's analysis of medical issues. I feel confident that he's the most knowledgeable doctor. Therefore, I want to go and follow his prescription for my condition. Will all rational people agree with you that this is an acceptable path to take, or there are some doubts? And if something happened with that treatment, you died, God forbid, something happened to you, there are a lot of people, rational people who will blame you. And they will tell you, why didn't you go to a living doctor? Which is the case? You tell me. Intellectually, rationally, which is the case? Therefore, you have two paths here. One is certain. If I go to a living physician, no one's going to blame me. Rationally, I'm fulfilling my obligation. I'm not being irresponsible. But if I go to a physician who has passed away and I use their prescription, I could be blamed. It's not clear 100% that you can do that and you're free from your moral obligation of protecting yourself. Or in fact, let's say it's your child. Let me give you a more pressing example. Because with yourself, people think they could do whatever they want with themselves. But let's say you have a child. Your child is diagnosed with a medical condition, a serious condition. And that child is a trust in your hands. So you have two paths. Either go to a living physician and get your child treated, or take out the prescription of a dead doctor and give it to your child. Rash people in the rational society, what do they impose on you to do? They so go to the living doctor. If you went to the dead doctor's prescription and something happened to your son, you're blamed. You will be considered as an irresponsible father in the eyes of a lot of people. See, when you're presented with something that's certain and something that's doubtful, the intellect dictates, go with that which is certain. Apply the same concept to the maraja.
You may be prosecuted.
You may be what?
Prosecuted.
Exactly. There could be even legal ramifications and consequences. However, if you followed that marja in your lifetime and the marja died, rational people accept you following their fatwas, even if they've passed away, and they accept it as being 100% acceptable, and it frees you from your obligation. Just like you going to a doctor for 30 years and they give you this pill and it works for you. The doctor dies, you continue taking that pill. Is that acceptable now in the eyes of the public? Is it different than following someone who passed away and who never treated you while they were living? Do you see the difference between them? There is a difference between them, right? I had my family doctor, my physician, my surgeon. For 30 years, he or she treated me. They died, I continue that treatment. It's okay in the eyes of most people. But if I start the treatment with the prescription of a dead doctor, that's the area which is unclear. And maybe a lot of rational people have a problem with. Same concept with the maraja. By the way, there's more evidence to that. Legally, it gets technical. But I just want to give you the intellectual, rational perspective for why we are to follow a living marja. Any question on this particular point? Any objections? Does it make sense, or you have other perspectives? Remember, this is not an area of consensus amongst Shia scholars. As we mentioned, many akhbaris differ. And they say, no, as long as you're following the fatwa of an expert, it's fine. Doesn't have to be necessarily living. Whereas most usulis have maintained that this is a condition. And this is one of the arguments that they've cited. It's an intellectual argument that binds you intellectually. Yes?
So, as far as that thought process that you could follow a dead maraja, so everything is ever evolving from that standpoint. So if something changes, how do they justify? Is it a representative from the office who says, okay, we are going to change it, but the guy's dead, how can you?
So that's a good question. What about with new events, new situations where the dead marja has no fatwa on? What do you do? in that area, it's a given that you need to follow another scholar who's knowledgeable, who has a fatwa on that. So the akhbari way of doing it, let's say, or those few usulis who've allowed this, they tell you, follow that marja' who passed away in all of his rulings. Except in those new rulings that require the expert opinion of a living person, in those rulings you refer to the living marja'. So yes, that's one way of addressing this concern. So they have a way out for this one. So you're following two marjas, the one who passed away and the one who's living.
But even with those existing rulings, or the rulings that the marja came out with, even with the living marjas, there could be a ruling that they came out with based on events that are taking place within that course of time. But 2 decades later, that same ruling could change. So in that regards, even that same ruling that was binding before, now it has changed. There's a new binding ruling. So how does that scenario apply to the other?
If there is a new perspective from scholars due to shifting conditions in society or in science or in medicine or whatever, if that is the case, where now the expert community is saying clearly that fatwa which was issued 50 years ago was not considering these new conditions, then yes, now the layperson who's following has evidence that this fatwa is not applicable to these conditions. So they would have to they would have to refer to a living scholar to define that for them. But let's say issues where they're not affected by society. You know, the technicalities of salah, for instance, a lot of fatwas that have to do with fasting, with khums, the things that maybe are not so impacted by these conditions, the person will still follow the marja' who passed away. But in these new situations, then yes, they need to follow someone who's alive. That's the argument. So it is a type of taqlid, where you're following the one who passed away with, the more simple fatwas, whereas the complex issues that require an expert to examine them now based on changing conditions, you refer to a living one. So some of them have allowed this actually. Those who accept following a dead marja', they're like, that's how we solve this problem.
But based on what you just mentioned, Sayyidina, and taking the logical and rational reasoning, simple fatwas, all of them are alike. As soon as it gets a little complex, that's when you have to refer. So from that standpoint,
what I mean by simple, I mean that the conditions of society today impact them. See, when it comes to salah even, the technical aspects of salah, you have some differences, but they're not influenced by society today and how our economy is behaving, the political structure, the family structure. It's not really influenced by that. In those areas, the person can follow that marja'. But let's say with modern issues that are determined by our society and the conditions of our society, surrogate mothers, cloning, new devices to look at the moon, telescopes, things maybe that were not present in the past, right? In these areas, we need the expert opinion of a living marja'. And that's what I mean by simple versus complex.
no, of course, I mean, I would consider those simple anyway, as far as
Right.
the rulings, because they will always be uniform across any decade or century. So,
But see, rulings come with conditions and prerequisites. Sometimes those conditions and prerequisites, they become complex. So let's say you follow Shaykh al-Tusi at a time where traveling was very different. Today we travel at a very fast pace. There's frequent travelers that are traveling away where people in the past probably could not travel. See, these are now complex issues arising out of our lifestyle, which the previous marja' did not have a fatwa that applies to these conditions. In these conditions, I would refer to a living scholar. That's the argument here. But again, most usulis have not accepted this. They say you have to follow a living marja'. Yes.
Usually there's a phenomenon of almost, and I don't know how recent this is, but schools of thought of maraja'. So for example, once Ayatollah Sayyid Khoury dies, then his followers will go to Ayatollah Sistani, or Ayatollah Khomeini's will go to Ayatollah Khamenei. What about when the teacher and student differ in their rulings? Let's say about the methodology of sighting the moon, or whether years of salah should be made up or not. Would the person who's muqallid of the previous scholar who's now passed away, do they have to switch to the living marja if their philosophy is a little bit different from their teachers? Or would they stick to what's more convenient?
So basically, with the example that you mentioned, let's say Ayatollah Khoyan Sistani, you will find that there are differences of opinion between the teacher and the student. The example of the moon sighting. Ayatollah Khoi believed in the unity of horizons, whereas Ayatollah Sistani believes in the multiplicity of horizons. It has to be sighted in an area that shares the horizon. You cannot follow another place that's far away. See, there's a difference now. Now, when your marja' dies, the argument is, if you followed that marja' when they were alive, and you still believe that the marja' is the one who passed away, is still the most knowledgeable, and the current one, his student or someone else, is not as knowledgeable, in fact, you stay following that marja', because you still believe they are the most knowledgeable, and that's the second condition we'll discuss. However, if you believe, after following Ayatollah Khoi, that now, maybe 5 years later, 10 years later, one of the current maraji' is now the most knowledgeable, then you would have to refer to the living one. So it goes back to the second condition of knowledge, whether that's a condition or not. So if you don't know if there is another scholar who's as knowledgeable as Khoi or more knowledgeable than him, you keep following him. You don't have to follow the living marji' who's a student. Yes, if you believe that his student is equal in knowledge or is more knowledgeable, then you make that switch. These are the conditions that allow you to make the switch.
And then that person, even if they're alone, they would be justified in celebrating their Eid alone?
So if you follow the fatwa, for example, of the marji' who passed away, oh yes, you will celebrate the Eid based on his fatwa. So if his fatwa is the multiplicity of, is the unity of horizons, right? Did I say them differently? Yes. Sayyid al-Khoi says the multiplicity of horizons. No, the unity of horizons. And Sayyid Sistani says the multiplicity of horizons. So let's say you follow a marji' who says in the unity of horizons. So they see it somewhere in the Middle East or somewhere in South America where you share a night with them. Tomorrow is your Eid. Even if the current marji' and Najaf has another fatwa, and they believe in the multiplicity of horizons, and their Eid is in 2 days from now, you would follow the fatwa of the marji' who passed away, yes. That's how it would go. So this is the first condition. The second condition that scholars have discussed is the marji' being the most knowledgeable. What's the evidence for that? The argument is follow an expert. As long as you're following an expert, your taqlid is valid. Why does your marji' has to be the most knowledgeable? Or at least you feel confident that he's the most knowledgeable. Why? Where did we get this condition from?
Is it the Quran?
Where in the Quran? Does it say you have to follow the most knowledgeable?
I mean, there is that verse, I think it's Surah Yusuf, over every knowledgeable person is the most knowledgeable.
Yes, وَفَوْقَ كُلِّ ذِي عِلْمٍ عَلِيمٍ. Over every knowledgeable one, there is someone who's higher in knowledge. Now this is describing a reality. But in what way does it bind you to follow the one who is a'lam, the one who has more knowledge?
Well, why settle for less when you could go for...
Well, as long as the less saves me, I'm fine with it. As long as it's qualified, I'm fine with it. I just need to follow someone who's qualified, the argument is. Someone who's an expert. As long as I've accepted that they are an expert, it's enough. Yes, it's better to follow the more knowledgeable, no doubt. But is it binding? Is it wajib? What's the basis for it being wajib?
Did we cover that in rational, the first or second class, in terms of what the Imam mentioned?
A hadith?
Narration-
Yes.
narration goes that that's
So we have two types of proofs. One's the intellectual, logical proof. One is the hadith that some have cited. Before we get to that hadith, give me an intellectual, logical proof, such that if we dispute this hadith, somebody considers it weak, somebody says, look, this is talking about judges, not maraja, because that's one of the arguments against the hadith. Then at least we have an intellectual, rational proof.
Well, from an intellectual, rational perspective, even in the universities or colleges out there,
Or if you have medical condition, you go to the
most knowledgeable for the medical condition, for example. So even in layman's society, they would go to the most knowledgeable person, even though if there are two professors with the same credentials and background. But you can see that the one professor knows that this other professor is more knowledgeable in this area, and you would see they would go and seek knowledge or guidance from them, sit in their classes. So from a rational perspective, in terms of what's happening in terms of societal norms, that's common practice.
So rational people will tell you that if you have a medical condition and you want to take your son to a physician, there's 2 physicians in town, 3 physicians in the US or wherever you have access to. They're all qualified, no doubt about that. They have the credentials. But one of them, based on your research, has more expertise, seems to do the surgery better, has more command of medicinal knowledge to do that surgery. Okay. Do rational people obligate you to go to the doctor who's more knowledgeable and more experienced? Or they tell you as long as you're going to a doctor, that's fine? And it's a serious condition. It's like a life-threatening surgery. What do rational people dictate? The argument is the rational people will tell you you need to go to the most knowledgeable. If you took your son to the less knowledgeable doctor and he died in operation, there are rational people who will blame you. And they will tell you, why didn't you not take your son to the better doctor? And by the way, we're assuming that you have equal access to them. Because some people will come and tell you, no, rational people don't operate like that. There's a top doctor in New York who charges X amount for the surgery. I'm not obligated to take my son to him. Yes, there are factors of distance and cost that rational people take into consideration, of course. Let's say there's a doctor in India, in Delhi, that I can go to who's better. Of course, rational Americans are not going to obligate me, take your son all the way to India, because that's a burden or it's a difficulty. So you have to consider doctors that you have equal access to. In that scenario, rational people, you must go to the one who's more knowledgeable. But if one is charging 10 times more and you really don't have that money and you need to go borrow, then it's not clear that they obligate you in that case. Keep that in mind though. We're talking about doctors who are equally accessible to you. Because if we don't make this condition, I've seen some people make this argument, well, today in any field, if you research, there's definitely some top expert in the world somewhere. He could be in the UK in one area, one could be in India, one could be in Japan, one could be in America. You don't see people, rational people, when making medical decisions, searching for these doctors somewhere in the world. And that's true, rational people don't go that far. Why? Because they don't have that much access to these doctors. Yes, if you're someone who's super rich, you're a millionaire, you could easily go to the UK and spend to save your life, knowing that there's the best doctor there. If you don't go, your circle of friends will blame you. They will tell you, look, you had the funds, you could have taken, yes, it cost maybe $200,000 there, but you knew that that doctor was more qualified to save your son. Why didn't you? There's an element of blaming. But you, the average citizen, no one's going to blame you. Why didn't you go to the UK and spend $200,000 to treat your son? You get the idea, right? So we're assuming that they're pretty equal in access. So if that's the case, rational people do dictate that you have to follow the more knowledgeable one. And we go back to the same intellectual argument that we mentioned about the dead and the living marja. We have ta'yin and takhir. I know for sure, if I follow the marja who's more knowledgeable, I have fulfilled my obligation. Do I have any doubts about fulfilling the obligation? Not at all. But if I follow the less knowledgeable marja, then it's doubtful whether that is valid in the presence of a more knowledgeable marja. So now you have certainty versus doubt. The intellect says, take the certain path. And that in itself binds us to do our best to figure out who's the most knowledgeable and follow them. You see the idea here? After the rational principle, we examine hadith. And there's the hadith of Dawood ibn al-Husayn, which we mentioned before. It's a hadith that a lot of marji'as have accepted in terms of the chain. And this is from Al-Imam Abi Abdullah Sadiq alayhi salam. في رجلين اتفقا على عدلين جعلاهما بينهما في حكم وقع بينهما فيه خلاف. The Imam was asked about two Shia. They disputed over a case. Then they went to two experts to resolve the case for them. فاختلف العدلان بينهما. These two just experts had different opinions. The first one said, my opinion based on my understanding of the school of Ahlul Bayt is that this is the solution for your case. The other expert said no. He contradicted the first one. He says no, this is the ruling. So who's going to pass the judgment? Whose judgment am I going to take now? When the two experts have disagreed. The Imam alayhi salam mentioned in his reply, يُنظَرُ إِلَىٰ أَفْقَهِهِمَا وَأَعْلَمِهِمَا. Look at who has more fiqh and more knowledge. Better understanding in terms of expertise and more knowledge. Who's more knowledgeable? Take his ruling. بأحاديثنا, about our hadiths, not about science or something else. Because remember, this is a religious issue. فَيَنْفُذُ حُكْمُهُ. And the hukum, the ruling, the sentence that he will issue is the one that will be binding on you. Well, this is a hadith in which the Imam ﷺ is being asked about two experts giving their opinion about a case. The Imam says, go with the more knowledgeable. So there are scholars who have cited this hadith that says, see, this is evidence that in taqlid, you have to follow the more knowledgeable in areas of disagreement. If the more knowledgeable says this is halal, and the less knowledgeable says this is haram, go with the more knowledgeable, and vice versa. Because if they're equal in their fatwa, they have the same fatwa, then it doesn't matter who you're following. It's the area where they differ in their fatwa that you need to follow the most knowledgeable. The argument that some scholars have against this hadith is that this hadith is about the hakim. It's about a hukum. It's a legal case, right? Basically, it's not an official court because the Shias did not have official courts at the time. But these people disputed in a matter and they needed a judge who's well versed in religious teachings to give them a ruling and khalas, that's binding. So the Imam says, if there are two judges giving their opinions about a matter, go with the more knowledgeable one. But it's not about taqlid per se. It's about judges, and there's a difference between a judge in court issuing you a ruling and between a marji' who's giving you their expert fatwa. So this is the rebuttal or the argument that some scholars have against this hadith, that it's applicable to judges but not to maraja'. But remember, with the first principle that we discussed, the rational principle, whether we can cite this hadith or not, we still have a rational principle. So what are your thoughts about the issue of following the most learned? Do you see this as clearly being a condition, or it does not seem like it's a condition and you can just follow any expert scholar?
Well, how are we supposed to know
who is the most knowledgeable? We'll get to that briefly. But before that, the concept of following the most knowledgeable, is that something that you find binding, or no, you disagree?
Well, due to the fact that you brought two different scenarios, you used rationality and then you used narrations. But based on the concept of rationality and what seems following logical reasoning, some people could easily make a case in this area and say that due to these factors today, my logical reasoning dictates that essentially for XYZ ruling, it doesn't make sense.
The ruling does not make sense.
The ruling does not make sense.
Of the most knowledgeable.
Or
any marja.
Or any marja. Maybe all marjas have the same ruling based on one specific scenario, but due to worldly conditions and whatnot, and your logical reasoning that could be shared across many different individuals, group of intellectuals as they would call it, they would say, yeah, that just doesn't make sense. And based on that concept of rationality, if this doesn't make sense, then why should I follow the rest of the stuff that they're saying? I see a lot of
That's an objection, yes. You find a few rulings not making sense, and that causes you to doubt the whole system altogether. We'll get to that in a couple of minutes when we talk about one other aspect related to the a'lam, the one who's most knowledgeable, and how to determine that. So once we've accepted that you need to, in principle, follow the most learned, the question is, how do you know who is the most learned? There are basically three ways. The first way is called الشياع المفيد للعلم. And basically the idea behind this first way is that if you see law-abiding Muslims, practicing Shias, who care about their religion, in cities that are conservative and they have the seminaries, in other parts of the world, you find the majority of them following a marja. And the nature of that gives you confidence that he is the most learned. And that's probably why most people are referring to him. If the nature of these people following that marja gives you such confidence, then in that case, this is a way to determine who's the most learned. Just like in any profession, by the way. Here in America, ex-doctor has the reputation in New York of being the best surgeon in his field. Word of mouth, people. You see most people agreeing that he's the most knowledgeable. And you don't have reason to doubt why people are following him. You're ruling out other factors. For instance, if that doctor is a millionaire, he has a lobby, and he's spending billions to advertise, then you could tell, okay, I can easily attribute why people are following him to his advertising, to his, his propaganda machine. In every billboard and in every magazine, and he's flooded America with his advertising, and people follow ads, let's face it. So when you look at most Americans who say he is the most knowledgeable, if you have reasonable reason, as someone would say, I have a reasonable reason. If you have reasonable reason to believe that he's become popular and known to be the most expert because of his good advertising, not because he really is the expert, then that does not give you confidence. So in this case, you don't have evidence. You cannot use this route. The marja that you're following, if you see most people in the religious community following a marja, and you don't believe, based on the evidence that you're seeing, based on the social factors that you're seeing, it's not because he can advertise better, right? It's not because of that. It's because really people just learned from experts that he is the most learned, and that generates confidence in you. That's a valid route in Islamic law, because itmi'nan, confidence is proof. Yes, in the eyes of Allah, I still don't know who really is the most knowledgeable, but this is an acceptable path. It's a rational path. So this is one way to determine who's the most knowledgeable. Sometimes it works, sometimes factors can make it not work. Like the examples that I gave. Or sometimes political factors, right, can be at play. The marja' could have the political backing of some group, and because of that they became popular. See, if that's a reasonable, plausible scenario here, then yeah, this would not be a valid way. And that's why maraja', when they mentioned this way, they said which kind of popularity, right, indicates that the marja' is the most knowledgeable. Not any popularity, a type of popularity that gives you certainty and confidence by rational standards. If that is the case, then you can. I'm sure you will get different perspectives on this one. You will have some people saying, yes, this marja' became the most popular because of this political factor and this factor and that factor. Others will disagree. They say, no, because he naturally was the most knowledgeable in the seminary, and so he just stood out. It doesn't matter what people say. You, between you and your Lord, what conclusion do you draw? Do some research, ask some people, ask some experts, and see how they feel about this. As long as you've done that rationally, you've done it reasonably, between you and Allah, if you follow that marja', you're off the hook. You followed an expert who seems to be the most knowledgeable. Yes, if you have reason to doubt this aspect and you could attribute the popularity of this marja' to political factors, to other factors, in that case you need another route. We'll talk about the other two routes. So this route may not be available for you, but it could be available for a lot of people.
Would you say, Sayyidina, today, as far as the growing number of people who want to move away from taqlid are actually pinpointing or nagging about such issues, that it's due to some political popularity or some groups following this marja' versus that marja', and hence...
Some people are making these statements. In fact, some people will even outright tell you, yeah, even the houses have lobbies, and the lobbies can choose which marja' is going to be the grand marja'. Some people do say that, right? And by the way, we don't live in a utopian world in which no factor is going to influence any outcome. There are hundreds of factors at play. Yes, historically, we see that the marja' who was the most knowledgeable in the seminary, through his classes, through his works, basically his students and the people in the seminary, there was an understanding, or from peers, that he is the most knowledgeable. So, a lot of times that is known. But there are factors that can influence that. Political factors, social factors. A lot of factors can influence that. So between me and my Lord, if I believe, objectively, doing some research, asking some experts, if I believe these factors are at play, and that makes me doubt whether this person really is the most knowledgeable, then in that case, I need to look for another route. So this could work in some areas, it could not work in other areas. It's not a definite route, but it is a rational route in a lot of areas. The second route is to follow two experts who are adil, just. And if you do that, and they tell you, we believe based on our expertise that X scholar is the most knowledgeable, Islamically, that's enough for you. Why? We have many hadiths about legal cases, religious cases. If you want evidence, legal evidence in Islamic court, in any case, you go to two adils, two just witnesses. That's the concept of two just witnesses. So number one, they have to be just, you can trust them. You have to be truthful. Number two, they're experts in their field. As long as they're experts, they have hawza, training, they are experts, they are at a capacity to kind of evaluate who may be more knowledgeable when looking at their works. As long as you go to two scholars who are experts, and they testify that we believe X scholar is the most knowledgeable, Islamically, that's enough. You fulfilled your obligation. So that is the second route. What if the experts contradict one another and they disagree? Choose those experts that you're more confident with. Choose the experts whom you think are more of an experts, or they're more truthful. And that's how you resolve it. So two experts say, the first marja' is the most knowledgeable. These two experts say, no, the second marja' is the most knowledgeable. And they're experts, they're just. Basically, which of these two do you trust most, and you think they have better expertise? Whatever you felt confident with, in Islamic law, that's enough. Remember, even in court with very important issues, the religion of Islam, starting with the Prophet ﷺ, he accepted the testimony of two just witnesses. And this is an area where you rely on two just witnesses to tell you whom they think is the most knowledgeable. Yes, in some areas Islam has stipulated 4, like adultery, but that's an exception. In all cases, 2 just witnesses are enough, except in some cases where the Sharia said no, we need, let's say, more witnesses. So this goes back to the default when it comes to this matter. Any objections to this second route?
The second route sounds more reasonable than the first.
It sounds maybe more reasonable, more practical, yes. So this is a route that's available to anyone. Ask 2 experts and that's fine. Number 3, the third path is the most difficult path. You research yourself. See, you need to maybe study 30, 40 years to be a marja. But you don't need to study 30, 40 years to know how to evaluate the research that they do. So if you go 10, 15 years in the seminary, you do your research, after a while when you examine the way that they are extracting the laws, you kind of develop the experience to evaluate. Have you seen sometimes when you go to college, you're in a class and you're experienced in that class, and then there are 2 presenters? You're not as good as the presenters. They're definitely higher than you. You're maybe masters, they're PhD. But given that you are in the master's program and you know how the system works, you can evaluate which of these PhD professors seems to be more knowledgeable. You can make that objective evaluation because you know how the system works. And so they're showing you how they're extracting the law. So that's the third route, which is tough. It's not available to a lot of people. So choose one of these 3, and that's how you find the most knowledgeable. And if you couldn't, in the end, you could not reach at someone who's the most knowledgeable, then at least limit it to a circle of maraji' who seem to be equal in knowledge, or at least the most knowledgeable is one of them. If you believe they're equal in knowledge, then choose any one of them, that's fine. If you believe they're equal in knowledge. Like the research that you've done, it's all indicating, look, they're pretty much comparable. They're pretty equal. I could not decipher which one's the more knowledgeable. They're pretty equal. Follow any one of them, that's fine. Intellectually, you can follow any one of them. They're both valid to follow.
I'm sorry, was this a 4th one or is this part of the condition of the 3rd one?
Well, this is basically, if these 3 did not yield you results to find out who's the most knowledgeable, then the next step would be just to follow one of them who's an expert. If you could not determine who's the most knowledgeable, just follow one of them, that's fine.
But isn't it the 3rd route, Sayyidina, where we have a lot of these new modern speakers today that are actually criticizing the marajas out there?
See, these modern speakers are not experts. That's why I said you need at least 10, 15 years of seminary training to know how the system works. Right? And the example I gave is someone who's like in the master's program. They know. By now they've studied. You know, when you're in the master's program, you've been studying for how many years now? 12 years, and then 4 years of college, and then 2 years. Almost 20 years of studying by now. Just keep that in mind. Right? And then there's someone who's a PhD. You can begin to start evaluating. And remember, this does not apply to everyone, by the way. Somebody could be in the seminary 50 years, mashallah, and they're still like some people who keep taking college classes for 30 years and they don't achieve anything. No, we're talking about someone who knows. Between him and his Lord, he studied well, he can evaluate. If you can, between you and your Lord, evaluate by having that firm experience, then yes, you can make that judgment for yourself.
You could easily slip with the 3rd route, though. I mean,
it's a rational route. See, as long as something is rational, we don't have an infallible way. The only infallible way is Allah sending Jibreel telling you who's the most knowledgeable. We have to look for rational ways that follow the spirit of Islam to determine these things. But remember, this 3rd way, you need to be an expert. Not marja' level expert, but close to ijtihad to make that determination. So you must have read the works of these maraji'. You must know legal theory, you must know the Arabic language, you must know the hadith, you must know fiqh, you must know all of that. You're very highly qualified. At that level, you can make an evaluation. And sometimes you even cannot, that's fine. If you could not make that evaluation, two maraji' seem to be equally knowledgeable, follow one of them, it's okay. It's valid, rationally that's valid.
So in the meantime, if it's going to take me 20 years or 30 years, it's okay then not to follow anybody till then?
In the meantime, I have to use one of the other two routes until I reach the third one. Because you cannot stay without one of these three. In the end, you have to practice Islamic law. What will your basis be during these 20 years? Your fatwas? You're not an expert to give fatwas. So what do you do?
I'm studying.
Okay, you're studying, but you're not an expert yet. As long as you're not an expert yet, you cannot say, I put this system away until I get there. Rationally, that's condemned by rational people. Because in the meantime, if you made mistakes, if you couldn't get it right, you're to be blamed. Because you're not following anyone who's an expert. Choose the second route. We have hadiths from the Prophet, from the Imams, from every Imam, that in a lot of cases, right, to determine the outcome of a case, go to two adils, two just witnesses. The Quran even mentions it. Why not apply it to this field? Go to two adils, it's on them. In fact, the Prophet ﷺ, in a hadith, Rasulullah, in a hadith, he says, that's accepted by all Muslims. The Prophet says, when you come to me for disputes, I go by bayyinah. I go by testimonies and evidences. If some of you fabricate your evidence in court, or you lie in your testimonies, Allah did not command me to act on my unseen knowledge. I will give it to you. Let's say you have a dispute about a piece of property. Zayd says it's mine, Amr says it's mine. So they went to the Prophet, Ya Rasulullah, you be the judge. The Prophet tells Amr, okay, what's your evidence? Zayd, what's your evidence? So Zayd, he goes and brings two just witnesses who are known in the community to be just. But he made a deal with them and they're lying. Look, just doesn't mean you're infallible. It means you're reliable. But for whatever reason, he gave them 1,000,000 dinars to entice them. And they went and lied. The Prophet ﷺ says, well, as long as you brought those two witnesses in court, I will rule in his favor. But he must know that when I ruled for this piece of property in his favor, I have given him a piece of hell. This is the words of the Prophet. Nar, he uses fire. I've given him a piece of fire. Because he knows that this is fabricated. And I have to go by the apparent evidence, not by my ilm al-ghayb. So yes, I ruled this land to be for you. But since you know that it's not your rightful land, then you're playing with fire, in other words. See, even the Prophet says, I go by the testimony of two just witnesses. Apply it here. Don't say, no, I'm not going to follow anyone until in 20 years I become an expert. Because who are you going to follow in the next 20 years? You have to follow something. You can't stay in limbo. The time for salah comes, hajj, khums, zakat, all these laws. Who are you going to follow? Who? Your opinions, you haven't looked at it yet. You're not an expert yet. So who are you going to follow in the time being? Yes, you want to take the precautionary route where there's 20 maraji', you take the toughest fatwa. Okay, that's fine. You want to burden yourself like that? Ahla wa sahla. Usually these people, they want an easy way out. So they're not going to choose this one for sure. I guarantee you. It's rational.
I mean, that's the thing. I mean, they can start debating and arguing these other factors along those intellectual lines, but the basic element that you can present to them, all right, for your prayers, for your salah, your fasting, your hajj, how are you determining how to do that at this point? I mean, they get stuck at that point. They can't really answer that.
And that's the challenge. The very last point about taqlid, and with that we will end the discussion on taqlid. The marji' has to be the most knowledgeable, right? Most knowledgeable in what? Huh?
I mean, I know there's so many areas. So
Yeah, so in what? They're most knowledgeable in what? Exactly.
certain areas.
Holistically, fiqh.
Okay, so they're more knowledgeable in fiqh. But define that. What is fiqh though? Somebody will ask you today, what's fiqh? How would you put that?
Hadith, ulum,
So they're the most knowledgeable in hadiths, Like what about hadith? Like memorizing the hadiths?
No, understanding and explaining that.
Understanding and explaining the hadith?
Deciphering the meaning.
And
Deciphering the meanings?
Legal theory as well.
Legal theory, which helps you develop principles taken from hadith to apply. Scholars and experts have mentioned the marja has to be the most knowledgeable in extracting Islamic laws from their sources, which is the Quran and the Sunnah, taking the principles and having an amazing ability to apply them to particular cases. See, lawyers, they study principles in law. Then when you go to court and there's a trial, you have to use what you know about general principles from law, from constitution, from the Bill of Rights, from whatever, and apply it to this case, to that case, to that case. The application requires expertise. Not everybody knows how to take general principles and apply them to specific cases and to know which case belongs to which principle. Have you seen those confusing SAT questions? Where it gives you a principle and it says, this applies, see, it gives you like 4 answers. And you have to choose which one does this apply to most? And those, you hate those questions, right? Most. Because you look at 3 of them like,
it all makes sense.
they all make sense. It seems to apply to them. But the real expert can determine, no. For these reasons, only B is correct here. See, that requires a lot of experience for you to do that. So when we're talking about a marja who's most knowledgeable, he's most knowledgeable in that process. He has a command on this process. Today, unfortunately, a lot of people are confusing what most knowledgeable means. Today, a young man, a youth will come to you, Sayyid, this marja, he knows more scientific terms, so he's most knowledgeable. That's not an indicator of being the most knowledgeable. This marja knows how to speak, he can give a speech. That marja, I've never heard him speak in his life. That's not an indicator.
This marja can save me money.
This marja can save me money. Well, that's convenience now. But we're talking about knowledge. Or I've seen people every year, when you have this Eid and the crescent controversy, some people will tell you that I will believe in X marja because they believe in the unity of horizon or they believe in the telescope. Whereas that marja who does not believe in the telescope, he doesn't know anything about science, so he's less knowledgeable. So this marja is more knowledgeable. That's not acceptable. That's not a way to determine. That marja may be more knowledgeable, the one who says you can follow the telescope. But you cannot make that determination just based on that. You're following a marja because you're trusting their understanding of hadith and Quran. What they understand from Quran and hadith. It's not a requirement for the marja to be a scientist. Yes, sometimes the marja needs to know some science to present the case for you. The marja is not coming up with scientific laws for you. Go and follow a physicist for that. The marja is giving you rulings. Hukm. What's the law of Allah? That's it. What do we understand from this hadith? Regardless of what science is developing these days. Science gave you the telescope. So what? Does this marja better understand hadith and apply the general principles to cases or no? That's all. So keep that in mind. And I think a lot of people have this confusion about what it means to be the most knowledgeable. Or I remember once there was a person who was, very emotional about the marja that he was following, and he said, "My marja, I've read a book he's written in psychology. He knows more than every other marja. He's an up-to-date modern marja." It's very good for the marja to know psychology. I respect that marja who can write in psychology. I'll put him on my head. But that's not a factor that independently will determine he's more knowledgeable. On what basis are you making that conclusion? Yes.
What if in the actual terms of deciphering which marja is to be followed and they're the most knowledgeable, that marja who can write in psychology and the actual most learned in also other fields, they're equal in the terms that you've just described. They know how to apply from Quran and Sunnah, and they're equal over there. Then what's the second,
So if you believe in the first step, based on the research that you've done, they are equal in their understanding of Quran and Sunnah and their expertise in extracting laws from the Quran and Sunnah. But the second marja', because he's studied these modern fields, whether it's astronomy, whether it's psychology, sociology, whatever it is, and that allows them to better understand the conditions of a ruling and how that ruling can be applied in modern times. So this second marja' has this extra, right, expertise in that area, then yes, this could determine, this could be a valid reason why you would follow the second marja'. But remember, in the first step, you accepted that they're both equal in terms of extracting the law, in terms of legal theory and their mastery of legal theory, in terms of their understanding of Arabic and the Quran and the tafsir and the hadith. We're assuming they're equal in that first place, regardless of what science now is saying. Yes, if the second marja' seems to be able to implement those texts to modern conditions, then yes, that would be a factor to choose that second marja', definitely.
One day this girl asked me, is it true that Sayyid Sistani says girls can't wear pants?
See, scholars about this particular fatwa, girls can wear pants.
Pants.
Yeah, whether they can or not.
Haram to wear pants.
See, the scholars will give you the general ruling about hijab, right? Hijab is modesty. And the general ruling that they give you is any type of clothing that attracts attention and reveals the shape of the body, thereby provoking the opposite gender, that would violate the principles of hijab. The marja' is not going to come and tell you this fabric, this cloth, these can be socially determined. In some parts of the world, if a girl wears this outfit, it's provocative. It draws attention. In another part of the world, maybe it's not. So this could vary. So it's not just him, any other marja' will give you this general ruling. The marja' will say if it does draw attention, if it reveals the very exact shape of the body, well, that provokes the opposite gender. Same with men, by the way. If the men are wearing types of clothes that are provocative, that violates the concept of hijab. And the maraja' are clear on that. It's haram. They will tell you it's haram. If that's the case, it is haram. I myself have heard maraja' being asked this question, where women asked them, they forwarded this fatwa, can we see a sports match in which men are wearing shorts, they're looking good, and I'm seeing their body, and this could be a little bit provocative. The marja' said it's haram, you cannot watch that. They're very clear about this. Of course, society chooses to ignore these rulings from the maraja', but they're there.
I mean, it's very common. I mean, some of the perhaps sisters who are making this assumption that pants are haram, well, what qualifies as pants at the end of the day? Would leggings be pants?
See, exactly. The marja' is not going to sit there and tell you legging is this, the pants is this. They won't, right? They'll just give you the concept, the general concept. Yes, maybe someone privately asked him, if this is the case, and this is the case, what do you think? Maybe he gave his opinion. But there's nothing official about that.
Well, the girl I know, but I'll say Muhammad Hassan Farlan, I'm a sister. So one day, we were arguing about something. She said, do you know, how do you, I'll decide Sistani and you wear pants? You know it's haram, it's Sistani.
See, every marja' will agree with this principle. That if a girl, or even a boy, is wearing something that is provocative, it's haram. Simple as that. They all agree on that. There's no difference in that.
If it's a long shirt.
See, that's determined by society. If in that society, this is considered inappropriate in the eyes of practicing Muslims, and it is provocative, it draws attention from the opposite gender. The minute it draws attention, right, from the opposite gender, it violates the spirit of hijab.
And it's true both ways.
It's true both ways. It applies to men and it applies to women. So with that, my dear brothers and sisters, we conclude the discussion on taqlid. The next discussion we're going to have, which is an extension of Because remember last year we ended at imama and the imams of Ahlul Bayt and the 12th imam, and that's how we got into taqlid, because who represents the 12th imam in the absence? An extension of imama and glorifying the symbols of imams and the Prophet, of course, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and other prophets, is the construction of holy shrines, the gold that is used to decorate the domes and the minarets. And so there are some people today objecting that this violates the spirit of Islam, this is a waste of money, this is extravagance. Where do we have any evidence in our Quran or Hadith or rational law that you can do this to a person who passed away? And this is something unacceptable. It's better to take all this money and all this gold and give it to the poor and save starving people, instead of wasting it on these shrines. So this is an important discussion we'll examine next week, inshallah. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله الطاهرين.